It was supposed to be just another quiet night. Sarah, a young, responsible babysitter, had taken on what seemed like a routine job, watching over 2 children in a picturesque suburban home while their parents went out for a dinner date. The house, nestled on a peaceful cul-de-sac, seemed like the epitome of safety. The parents were kind, the children well-behaved, and the evening started off uneventfully. But as Sarah settled in for what she thought would be a calm night of TV and bedtime stories, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was off. It began subtly, a strange sound from the backyard, a shadow moving across the window. At first, Sarah dismissed it. It was probably just the wind or perhaps a neighbor passing by. But then the noises grew louder, closer. Her heart began to race. The kids were asleep upstairs, and she found herself alone, listening to the unsettling sounds of something or someone lurking outside. Suddenly, the phone rang. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, but no one was on the other end, just heavy breathing. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and panic began to set in. Was it a prank, or was she truly being watched? As the evening wore on, Sarah's unease grew into full-blown terror. The sounds of footsteps outside became more pronounced. She peeked through the blinds, but there was no one to be seen. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Someone who was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. She rushed to check on the children, her nerves frayed. But when she looked into the room where they slept, they were perfectly still, unaware of the growing danger. She tried to reassure herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, until a loud crash echoed from the back door. The killer had broken in. Her pulse pounded in her ears as Sarah scrambled to lock the door. She grabbed the children and rushed them into the basement, trying to keep her breath steady. She had to protect them. She couldn't let anything happen to them. But the sound of footsteps grew louder as the killer approached the basement door. Sarah's heart pounded as she tried to keep the children quiet, their eyes wide with fear. The air was thick with tension. Every second felt like an eternity. The killer had no face, no identity, just the terrifying certainty that death was lurking just steps away. In a terrifying twist of fate, the killer seemed to back off. The footsteps faded, and the house fell into an eerie silence. Sarah didn't know if it was a trap or a stroke of luck, but she knew she couldn't waste the opportunity. Grabbing the kids, she led them out the back door, praying they could make it to safety. But just as they reached the gate, a shadow loomed in front of them. The killer had circled around, anticipating their escape. Sarah's heart dropped, and in that moment, she thought it was over. But then, a gunshot. The killer stumbled, disoriented, as Sarah managed to pull the children into the street, yelling for help. The police arrived moments later, but the killer was gone. There was no trace, no clue as to who or what they had been dealing with. The investigation yielded nothing. No fingerprints, no DNA, no signs of forced entry, and no one who could identify the shadowy figure who had terrorized them that night. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's sense of relief quickly morphed into paranoia. She couldn't shake the feeling that the killer was still out there, watching, waiting for the right time to strike again. Months passed, and the case began to grow cold. But then, another babysitter disappeared. A similar situation. A young woman alone in a quiet house, watching children while their parents were out. The killer had struck again. And this time, there was a chilling connection to Sarah's case. The methods were identical. The same eerie sounds, the same feeling of being watched, the same heartbreaking silence after the attack. The police were left with no new leads, but Sarah knew the killer was back. And this time, they weren't just targeting anyone. They were targeting her. Years went by. The case became a haunting memory for most, but not for Sarah. The nightmares never stopped. The faces of the children she had protected that night haunted her every day, and the killer's voice still echoed in her mind. And then, out of nowhere, a break in the case. A new piece of evidence emerged, an old surveillance tape from a nearby convenience store, capturing a shadowy figure near the scene of the crime on the night of the first attack. It was grainy, distorted, but it was enough. Detective Ross, now head of the cold case unit, had been following the case for years. When he saw the footage, something clicked. He recognized the figure. It wasn't just any random person. It was someone who had been in Sarah's life all along. As Detective Ross dug deeper, a chilling truth emerged. The killer was someone Sarah knew, someone close to her, someone she had never suspected. The killer wasn't a stranger at all. It was someone who had been watching her for years, planning every move meticulously, all while maintaining the appearance of a normal, everyday person. The person responsible for terrorizing Sarah and countless others was none other than her former neighbor, a man named Thomas Hale. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Thomas Hale had been a seemingly harmless man, living just 2 houses down from Sarah. He had been in her life for years, yet no one had ever suspected him. He had meticulously planned every detail of his attacks, stalking his victims for months before making his move. When he was finally arrested, it was revealed that he had been obsessed with Sarah all along. His twisted fixation had driven him to target her and others like her, using his knowledge of the neighborhood and his connections to gain access to the homes of unsuspecting families. The trial was grueling, but in the end, Thomas Hale was convicted of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. His reign of terror finally brought to an end. Sarah, now a grown woman, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She had survived the nightmare that had haunted her for decades, but the scars would never fully heal. However, as the gavel came down in the courtroom, a sense of justice prevailed. The babysitter killer was no more. Though Sarah's life would never be the same, she found solace in the fact that the killer had been brought to justice. She finally felt safe. The nightmares began to fade, and the weight of the past seemed a little lighter. But as she walked away from the courthouse, one final thought lingered in her mind. What if there were more like Thomas Hale out there? What if the monster in the shadows was never truly gone? The world is full of secrets, some waiting to be uncovered, others hiding just beyond the reach of the law. The babysitter killer's story may have ended, but the darkness that once haunted Sarah's life would forever remain a reminder of the dangers lurking in the quietest corners of our world. The arrest of Thomas Hale brought a sense of closure to the case, but for Sarah, the healing process was far from over. Every day, she was faced with memories of that horrific night. The sound of the phone ringing, the feeling of the children's small hands in hers as they huddled in fear, the cold, malevolent presence of the killer lurking just outside the door. Even now, she couldn't escape the tension that clung to her, like a shadow that refused to leave. The town had moved on, but Sarah couldn't. Therapy became a part of her routine, and while it was painful to relive her trauma, it was the only way to begin unraveling the knots in her mind. She still had nightmares, vivid, haunting dreams that would leave her drenched in sweat when she woke up. Every noise at night sent her into a panic, her heart racing as she waited for the shadow of the past to catch up with her. Despite the conviction of Thomas Hale, something didn't sit right with Sarah. It wasn't just the fact that he had been the killer. There was a deeper unease gnawing at her. Hale had been meticulous. He had known how to strike, when to strike, and how to cover his tracks. There was no way he could have done all of this alone. His involvement in the case seemed too perfect, too orchestrated. Late one night, as Sarah lay in bed, a chilling thought crossed her mind. Had they caught the real killer? She couldn't let it go. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something, or someone, else out there, pulling the strings. Thomas Hale may have been the face of the terror, but who was the mind behind it? As Sarah dug deeper into her suspicions, she revisited the police files, flipping through the grainy photos and incomplete notes. She found an overlooked detail, a set of fingerprints discovered on the back gate of the house on the night she had escaped with the children. Those prints hadn't matched Thomas Hale's. They were someone else's. The discovery sent chills down her spine. Hale had been the killer, no doubt about it, but these prints, this new clue, suggested that someone else had been involved. Someone else had been lurking in the shadows, ensuring that Sarah's nightmare continued long after Hale's arrest. With the authorities dismissing her concerns as post-traumatic delusions, Sarah took matters into her own hands. She hired a private investigator to track down the origin of the fingerprints, hoping beyond hope that it would finally lead to the truth. Months passed, and the trail led Sarah and her investigator to a man named Raymond Brooks. Brooks had been an employee at a local hardware store, the same store that Thomas Hale had frequented in the years leading up to the murders. But it wasn't just his connection to Hale that drew suspicion. Brooks had a criminal background, a history of violent offenses, and a knack for blending into small-town life. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this man had been involved in something far darker than what anyone had realized. Raymond Brooks had vanished from the scene shortly after Hale's arrest, and his whereabouts were now unknown. The investigator suggested that Brooks had been working with Hale all along. The more Sarah learned about Brooks, the more her stomach turned. Was he the one pulling the strings? Was he the architect of the horrors she had survived? Sarah's investigation led her down a rabbit hole of deceit and secrecy. She learned that Raymond Brooks had lived under multiple aliases, making it nearly impossible to track him. He had been careful, too careful, and now he was nowhere to be found. The private investigator uncovered a potential lead. Brooks had spent time in a secluded cabin deep in the woods, a place no one had known about until now. Sarah felt an icy sense of dread as she stared at the address. She had to know the truth. She had to confront whatever darkness still haunted her. With her heart racing, Sarah, accompanied by her investigator, drove to the cabin. Hidden away on a forgotten stretch of land, the air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath their tires. The cabin stood silent, as if it had been abandoned for years, but something about it felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet. As they cautiously approached, Sarah felt her pulse quicken. They had to be careful. Raymond Brooks might still be lurking nearby, or worse, the man who had orchestrated the terror might be waiting for them to make a fatal mistake. The door creaked open, and inside, the air was musty, the walls lined with faded photographs and strange symbols. The place looked like it had been lived in recently. The walls were adorned with creepy drawings, sketches of the very house Sarah had babysat in, detailed images of the children she had cared for. The walls seemed to close in on her as the weight of the evidence hit her like a tidal wave. The evidence was undeniable. Raymond Brooks had been obsessed with Sarah, just as Thomas Hale had. But now it became clear that Brooks had been the mastermind, using Hale as a pawn in his twisted game. The photos, the drawings, the meticulous notes on his plans, it all pointed to the fact that the killings had been carefully orchestrated over the course of years. As Sarah went through the files, she found a disturbing revelation. Brooks had known Sarah's every move. His obsession went beyond the murder of the children. He had been watching Sarah for years, carefully laying out a plan to terrorize her life. Suddenly, Sarah's phone rang. It was a blocked number. Her breath caught in her throat. "Hello, Sarah," a voice whispered, so low it sent chills down her spine. The voice on the phone was unmistakable. It was Raymond Brooks. He had been watching her this whole time, orchestrating everything from the shadows. As Sarah listened to the quiet, mocking tone, she realized that the killer wasn't just a man. He was a force, a presence, an obsession that had driven him to manipulate every moment of her life. Brooks taunted her, telling her that he had always been in control. He had used Hale to carry out the killings, but in the end, it was always about Sarah. She had been his real target all along. She had been the prize he wanted to break. But now it was time for the final confrontation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah and her investigator set up a plan to trap Raymond Brooks. They knew he would come for her. The twisted game would end here one way or another. Hours passed in tense silence, the shadows stretching long as the night crept in. Then, just as they had expected, Brooks made his move. He arrived at the cabin, confident that his game would be over soon. But what he didn't realize was that Sarah had become stronger. She wasn't the terrified babysitter anymore. She was a woman driven by justice, determined to end this nightmare once and for all. With her heart racing, Sarah, accompanied by her investigator, drove to the cabin. Hidden away on a forgotten stretch of land, the air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath their tires. The cabin stood silent, as if it had been abandoned for years. But something about it felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet. As they cautiously approached, Sarah felt her pulse quicken. They had to be careful. Raymond Brooks might still be lurking nearby, or worse, the man who had orchestrated the terror might be waiting for them to make a fatal mistake. The door creaked open, and inside, the air was musty, the walls lined with faded photographs and strange symbols. The place looked like it had been lived in recently. The walls were adorned with creepy drawings, sketches of the very house Sarah had babysat in, detailed images of the children she had cared for. The walls seemed to close in on her as the weight of the evidence hit her like a tidal wave. The evidence was undeniable. Raymond Brooks had been obsessed with Sarah, just as Thomas Hale had. But now it became clear that Brooks had been the mastermind, using Hale as a pawn in his twisted game. The photos, the drawings, the meticulous notes on his plans, it all pointed to the fact that the killings had been carefully orchestrated over the course of years. As Sarah went through the files, she found a disturbing revelation. Brooks had known Sarah's every move. His obsession went beyond the murder of the children. He had been watching Sarah for years, carefully laying out a plan to terrorize her life. Suddenly, Sarah's phone rang. It was a blocked number. Her breath caught in her throat. "Hello, Sarah," a voice whispered, so low it sent chills down her spine. The voice on the phone was unmistakable. It was Raymond Brooks. He had been watching her this whole time, orchestrating everything from the shadows. As Sarah listened to the quiet, mocking tone, she realized that the killer wasn't just a man. He was a force, a presence, an obsession that had driven him to manipulate every moment of her life. Brooks taunted her, telling her that he had always been in control. He had used Hale to carry out the killings, but in the end, it was always about Sarah. She had been his real target all along. She had been the prize he wanted to break. But now it was time for the final confrontation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah and her investigator set up a plan to trap Raymond Brooks. They knew he would come for her. The twisted game would end here one way or another. Hours passed in tense silence, the shadows stretching long as the night crept in. Then, just as they had expected, Brooks made his move. He arrived at the cabin, confident that his game would be over soon. But what he didn't realize was that Sarah had become stronger. She wasn't the terrified babysitter anymore. She was a woman driven by justice, determined to end this nightmare once and for all. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Sarah decided to look into the backgrounds of everyone involved in that social circle. What she found left her stunned. One name in particular caught her attention: a man named James Rushing. James was an unassuming businessman who owned a small construction company in the area. He had never been connected to the case, but his name kept popping up in old records, often tied to Thomas Hale and Raymond Brooks. What was even more disturbing was the fact that James Rushing had been a regular visitor to the homes of several families who had been targeted by the killers, including Sarah's own. As Sarah dug deeper into James Rushing's life, she found something even more unsettling. Rushing had been heavily involved in a network of local organizations, charities, neighborhood groups, even youth programs, always playing the role of the respectable, community-minded businessman. But the deeper Sarah looked, the more it became clear that his persona was a mask, hiding something far more sinister. He had been close to Hale and Brooks, too close in fact, and had been a frequent presence in the lives of the very people they had targeted. Had he been part of their twisted scheme all along? Was he the mastermind who had orchestrated the entire thing? The investigation into James Rushing took Sarah into the heart of the community she had once called home. She started reaching out to people who had known Rushing personally. Former colleagues, neighbors, even former clients. What she uncovered was a pattern of behavior that only seemed to confirm her suspicions. Rushing's ties to Thomas Hale and Raymond Brooks went deeper than anyone had realized. Rushing had been a close mentor to both men, teaching them the ins and outs of manipulation and control. It was through Rushing that Hale and Brooks had learned how to stay under the radar, how to keep their dark urges hidden behind a mask of normalcy. Sarah also uncovered a disturbing trend. Rushing had been a part of a secretive group, an underground organization of men who operated in the shadows of society, each involved in dark, twisted activities, ranging from extortion to even more sinister acts. But Rushing had played a far more dangerous game. He was the one who had masterminded the entire operation, using his influence to keep Hale and Brooks under his thumb. pulling the strings from behind the scenes. As Sarah pieced together the puzzle, a horrifying realization settled over her. James Rushing wasn't just a passive participant. He had been the orchestrator of the entire nightmare. He had been the one who had introduced Hale and Brooks to their twisted obsession with Sarah. Rushing had always been in control, manipulating the events from the shadows and using his influence to remain untouchable. Sarah's investigation revealed that the killers weren't just targeting her. They had been targeting an entire community. The killings, the fear, the trauma, they had all been part of a larger, more systematic plan. Rushing's ultimate goal had been to create chaos, to break the community down, and to watch from the sidelines as his twisted experiment played out. It became clear to Sarah that the nightmare was far from over. The police had arrested the killers, but Rushing was still out there, untouchable. She knew that if she didn't act now, his influence would continue to spread, infecting every part of the community. Sarah had no choice but to confront James Rushing directly. She couldn't let him get away with everything he had done, not after all the lives he had destroyed. But to confront him meant stepping into his world, a world she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. With the help of her private investigator, Sarah tracked Rushing to a secluded mansion on the outskirts of town. The mansion was as cold and lifeless as its owner, standing tall and imposing in the middle of the forest. The air was thick with tension as they approached the gates. The mansion was a fortress, and Rushing was known to keep a tight security team. But Sarah was determined. She had come too far to back down now. Together with her investigator, she infiltrated the property, carefully making their way through the dense woods that surrounded the mansion. The trees loomed above them like silent sentinels, their shadows casting an eerie glow on the ground. The mansion loomed in the distance, and as they approached, Sarah's heart began to race. This was the moment of truth. They had to expose Rushing. They had to bring him to justice. As they neared the mansion, Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. This was it. She had spent years running from the darkness, but now she was ready to face it head-on. They managed to sneak inside, evading the guards and making their way through the dimly lit halls. The air felt suffocating, the silence deafening as they moved deeper into the heart of Rushing's domain. Every corner they turned brought them closer to the man who had haunted their lives for so long. They found Rushing in a lavishly furnished office, sitting behind a massive desk. His cold eyes narrowed as he saw Sarah and the investigator enter. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he seemed almost pleased, as if he had been expecting them. "You've come a long way," Rushing said, his voice smooth and confident. "But you won't find what you're looking for. You've already lost." His words hung in the air, taunting Sarah. He was the puppet master, the one who had orchestrated everything from the shadows. But this time it was different. Sarah wasn't the scared babysitter anymore. She was a woman who had survived hell and was ready to bring justice to those who had ruined her life. "I'm here to make sure you never hurt anyone again," Sarah said, her voice steady. The investigator, standing at her side, nodded in agreement. Rushing's smile faded. He had underestimated her strength, but it was too late for him now. With the authorities closing in, Rushing knew his reign of terror was over. The police arrived just as Rushing attempted to flee. In the final moments of his capture, he tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. As he was dragged away, he muttered something under his breath, words that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You think you've won, but this is only the beginning." His arrest was a massive victory, but the truth of what had happened was far darker than Sarah had ever imagined. James Rushing had been the true architect behind the entire nightmare. Hale and Brooks were his pawns, manipulated into carrying out his twisted plans. And with his arrest, the web of terror that had plagued Sarah for so long began to unravel. But even as Rushing was hauled off to prison, Sarah knew that the scars would remain. The damage had been done. Her life had been shattered, and no amount of justice could ever undo the pain she had suffered. Yet, in that moment, Sarah also understood something powerful. She had survived, and now, she would fight to ensure that no one else ever had to face the horrors she had endured. The weeks following Rushing's arrest were a blur. The town, once gripped by fear, slowly began to heal. The darkness that had loomed over Sarah's life for so long was finally lifting. But there was still one thing she needed to do, one final act of closure. Sarah returned to the house where it all began. The same house where she had once fought to protect the children, where she had faced the terrifying unknown. She walked through the front door, the place now empty of the terror it had once held. She stood in the living room for a long time, letting the memories wash over her, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Finally, she exhaled deeply. It was over. The nightmare was behind her. And though the scars would remain, she had reclaimed her life. Even after James Rushing's arrest, the ripples of trauma stretched far beyond Sarah. One by one, survivors began stepping forward. Young women now in their 30s and 40s who had worked as babysitters during the years of the killings. Each told a disturbingly similar story. Strange men lurking near the properties they worked at, anonymous letters mailed with no return address, threatening phone calls filled with silence or distorted breathing. Some had even reported break-ins, incidents the police once brushed off as random burglaries. But now, viewed under the harsh light of Rushing's orchestration, the connections became undeniable. This wasn't just a string of killings. It was a systematic campaign of terror. And Sarah hadn't been the only target. In the weeks that followed, a startling discovery was made. During a deep forensic search of James Rushing's estate, detectives found a locked compartment hidden behind a false wall in his study. Inside were boxes, hundreds of them, each marked with a name and a date. Inside each box were case files, victims, notes, schedules, blueprints of homes, personal photographs taken through windows, even stolen mementos, a child's drawing, a pacifier, a babysitter's scarf. And then there were the letters, meticulously typed, full of delusion, obsession, and godlike justification. In them, Rushing wrote about his experiments in fear, praising the manipulation of terror as an art form. He referred to babysitters as keepers of innocence, his chosen vessels to shatter for the sake of chaos. Sarah's name was mentioned over 90 times. She read the words in silence, while rising in her throat. He had seen her survival not as a failure, but as the ultimate result of his design. The terror had always been personal. Journalists dubbed Rushing's estate the House of Many Shadows, and for good reason. As forensic teams continued to dig through the property, they found a basement unlike anything they'd seen before. It was soundproofed, with walls covered in corkboard and pins holding up strings of connection between names, dates, victims, and newspaper clippings. An entire section was dedicated to Sarah, documenting everything from her high school graduation to her court testimony. But that wasn't the worst part. In one of the basement's corners stood a child's bedroom, pristine, as though waiting for a tenant. Toys, dolls, blankets, a small bed. This was a recreation of one of the rooms in the house from the original crime scene. The chilling realization settled in. This was a shrine, a theater of sick fantasy. Sarah broke down when she saw it. It was confirmation that her life had been under surveillance for decades. Rushing hadn't just wanted to destroy her. He had wanted to become the director of her trauma. The investigation uncovered that Rushing hadn't worked alone. Hale and Brooks were just two of many. Authorities began arresting other men connected to the underground group Rushing had secretly cultivated. Some were local, others were from different states. All shared a singular ideology: terror as power. This wasn't just a one-man operation. It was a decades-long network of psychological tormentors, carefully selecting towns to sow fear, babysitters to target, and communities to rip apart. The FBI named it Project Pandora, a code name born out of the myth of opening a box that released all the world's evil. And at the bottom of that box, hope, because thanks to Sarah's unrelenting pursuit of truth, the Pandora network was collapsing. The public response was overwhelming. News outlets scrambled for exclusive interviews. Documentaries began production. Books were announced overnight. And Sarah, now thrust into the national spotlight, became both hero and victim in the media's eyes. But she didn't want fame. She wanted peace. and answers. Behind the media buzz, however, a sinister narrative was being crafted, one of conspiracy and doubt. Fringe journalists questioned whether Sarah had played a larger role in attracting Rushing's attention. Online trolls accused her of being the muse of the killers, fueling more trauma. Rushing's defense attorneys subtly used this media manipulation during hearings, attempting to suggest that Sarah engaged the stalker in some psychological dance. It enraged her. This wasn't just about murder anymore. It was about reclaiming her truth. Another bombshell dropped when the FBI found dozens of videotapes in Rushing's estate. Secret recordings of the babysitters and children he had targeted. Some videos dated back 30 years. One particular tape was marked only with the word resurrection. Authorities hesitated to watch it, but Sarah insisted. What played was a reenactment, staged in the recreated bedroom found in Rushing's basement. A man, wearing a porcelain mask, narrating a fictionalized version of that night Sarah had escaped with the children. In the video, he lets her live. He calls her the perfect subject. The implication was clear. She had been spared by design. The tape destroyed her emotionally, but also ignited something deep within her. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was war. Sarah reached out to the other survivors. She didn't want to face this alone anymore. Together, they formed a coalition, the Watchlight Initiative, an organization dedicated to supporting victims of cold case stalking, babysitter terror crimes, and long-term trauma. They began sharing their stories in town halls, online platforms, and classrooms. The goal was to shed light on how evil hides in plain sight and how trauma doesn't end with an arrest. For the first time, Sarah saw what her pain had built. A community, a movement, a flame in the darkness. They weren't just survivors. They were witnesses, warriors, truth-tellers. The trial of James Rushing was one of the most highly televised cases of the decade. It lasted 16 weeks, involved over 200 witnesses, and unveiled horrors that shook even the most seasoned jurors. Rushing, ever smug, defended himself in court at times, insisting his actions were artistic commentary on society's fragility. He showed no remorse, no flicker of guilt. He even smirked during survivor testimonies. But Sarah was the last to testify. Her voice, though quivering, cut through the courtroom like steel. "You saw us as your characters, as puppets, but we're the ones who got the final act. And today, this story ends with justice." The courtroom fell into silence. Rushing, for once, didn't smile. The day the verdict was read, the courtroom overflowed with victims and families. The jury found James Rushing guilty on 67 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, abduction, illegal surveillance, and psychological terrorism. When the judge handed down 17 consecutive life sentences without parole, Sarah felt a weight lift from her chest. Rushing stared at her one last time as he was led away. That smug arrogance flickered and disappeared. Sarah would later describe it as watching a shadow die in the light. The monster was caged. The nightmare had an ending. Years later, Sarah found herself sitting on a quiet porch, the morning sun casting warm light through the trees. Birds chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. She sipped her coffee, breathing in peace. Not the absence of fear, but the acceptance of survival. She had scars, yes, but she also had power. She was no longer the babysitter frozen in fear while shadows danced outside. She was the woman who uncovered a decades-long nightmare, faced the face behind the mask, and lived to tell the story. The babysitter killer wasn't just a name in headlines anymore. It was a closed chapter, and she had written the ending. Even after the trial, the tremors of James Rushing's crimes continued to ripple through the lives of those affected. Families whose daughters had disappeared decades ago reopened grief they thought had been buried. Some now had answers, while others were left only with the chilling knowledge that their loved ones had been watched, stalked, toyed with, and then erased. In many cases, their bodies had never been recovered. Investigators turned to Rushing again, hoping to pry loose the last truths. But the man had gone quiet. He refused to speak. Not to his lawyers, not to the FBI, not even to the victims' families. He had gone back into the shadows, this time behind bars. The FBI formed a special task force to review cold cases from across the country now believed to be linked to the Pandora network. Dozens of unsolved babysitter murders were reclassified and investigated under a new lens. Each case held a terrifying similarity. The same psychological pattern, the same choice of target, the same fingerprints of emotional manipulation. But many had no physical evidence left, only stories frozen in time. Sarah watched as families clung to hope, desperately needing the same closure she had fought for. And so, she joined the task force not officially but as a liaison to victims. Her voice, once trembling in courtrooms, now echoed in war rooms. She wasn't just testifying. She was hunting the silence that had devoured so many lives. Months after the trial, a prison psychologist approached authorities with something disturbing. James Rushing had been speaking in riddles during his therapy sessions, dropping cryptic names and references that weren't just madness. They were coordinates, patterns, hidden messages woven into harmless sentences. It became clear, Rushing was still playing the game. The FBI raced to decipher the meaning behind these statements, fearing he had planted deeper secrets across the country. Unfound evidence, buried trophies, or even other accomplices still in hiding. Sarah sat in on the decoding meetings, her heart racing with each uncovered clue. She knew the man's mind. She had survived it. Now she would help dismantle it. One of Rushing's coded statements led to a rural town in Idaho, where a 14-year-old girl named Kayla Wentworth had gone missing in 2003 after babysitting a neighbor's child. Her case had grown cold, dismissed as a likely runaway. But when agents searched the neighbor's long-abandoned property, they found a sealed crawlspace. Inside, they uncovered Kayla's locket, still shining, untouched by time. And under layers of insulation, they found videotapes marked with Rushing's handwriting. He had never even visited Idaho, which meant someone else in the Pandora network had followed his playbook. Kayla had been a victim of the system he created. The discovery reignited the investigation and Sarah's resolve. Sarah's involvement in the ongoing investigations had a cost. Her nightmares returned. She began to question everything: her choices, her future, her peace. Was she chasing justice or just reliving her trauma over and over again? Her therapist warned her, "You can't live inside the monster's story forever. Eventually, it consumes you." But Sarah refused to stop. To her, each name on the case board was more than just a statistic. It was someone like her. Someone who once sat on a couch, reading a bedtime story, thinking they were safe while evil crept closer in the dark. She owed them more than silence. Another arrest was made in Wisconsin. A former school principal found with an entire room dedicated to surveillance records of teenage babysitters from the 90s. He had been part of Rushing's network. The Watchlight Initiative assisted the authorities, using survivor profiles to cross-reference victims, places, and stalking patterns. Sarah led public forums, teaching families how to identify signs of long-term predation. With every survivor that came forward, the network crumbled more. And yet, one file remained unopened. One name that haunted Sarah every time she closed her eyes: Emma Doyle, a 16-year-old who vanished in 1988 under circumstances eerily similar to the original case that started it all. Emma had never been found, but Sarah was ready to look deeper. In a dusty evidence room, one mislabeled VHS tape had been overlooked for decades. It had no case, no label, just a sharp scribble, ED. When played, it revealed footage of a young girl, Emma Doyle, inside a room resembling the shrine Rushing had created in his basement. She looked frightened, but she was alive in the video. A voice behind the camera whispered instructions, coaxing her to smile, to laugh, to pretend everything was okay. It wasn't Rushing's voice. It was someone else. And that voice was still out there. The FBI reopened the Doyle case. Sarah went to Emma's hometown herself, speaking to locals, digging through school archives, interviewing teachers and neighbors. She discovered that Emma's family had once hired a part-time handyman, a man who disappeared shortly after Emma did. He'd used multiple aliases. One of them appeared in Rushing's letters, Benedict. When the FBI tracked him down, he was living in a small cabin off the grid in Montana. Inside, They found dozens of dolls, each one styled to look like a babysitter. One had Emma's locket sewn into its chest. He was arrested on the spot. Emma's body was never recovered, but her case was finally closed. On the anniversary of Rushing's arrest, Sarah agreed to one final interview, a live broadcast viewed by over 20 million people. She spoke not just of pain, but of power, not just of darkness, but of the light found in truth. To the girls who were never found, to the families still searching, to the survivors too scared to speak, you are not forgotten, you are not alone, and your story is not over. It was a moment of catharsis, a reckoning. The screen faded to black, and then the words appeared, "Justice isn't the end, it's the beginning." Years later, children would read about the babysitter killer in textbooks. Documentaries would analyze his mind. Researchers would study the Pandora network. But what they'd always remember most was Sarah Miller, not as a victim, but as the woman who cracked a nightmare open, who dared to fight back, who turned fear into fire. She now lived in a quiet town, teaching self-defense to teenagers, mentoring survivors, and reminding the world that monsters may roam, but they don't win. They hide, and she hunts them down. 1 year after James Rushing's imprisonment, a chillingly familiar crime surfaced in Tennessee. A 17-year-old babysitter found dead, her body posed in a hauntingly similar way to Rushing's original victims. The crime scene mimicked Rushing's twisted trademarks, symbolic placement, ritualistic objects, even the use of nursery rhymes scrawled in lipstick on the walls. But it couldn't have been Rushing. He was in solitary confinement without outside contact. So who was trying to resurrect the nightmare? Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't over. Investigators scoured online forums and dark web chat rooms. They discovered a user named Cradle Watcher who had posted long, obsessive manifestos about James Rushing, studying his methodology like scripture. The poster had detailed knowledge of the original crime scenes that was never released to the public. When traced, the username led to Cameron Blythe, a 24-year-old criminology grad student, and the son of one of Rushing's earliest known associates. Cameron was arrested in his apartment, where investigators found a wall covered with photos of Sarah Miller, maps of her speaking engagements, and plans to attend her next event to finish what was started. He was a disciple, a successor, and he nearly succeeded. While in custody, Cameron Blythe revealed something no one expected. He had received letters from James Rushing, handwritten, mailed from prison. This discovery sparked outrage. Rushing was supposed to be in complete isolation. No mail, no visitors, no communication. So how had the letters made it through? A prison official came forward. Rushing had been bribing a corrections officer, sneaking out encrypted messages in legal mail under fake case names. The system had failed again. The officer was arrested. Internal investigations followed. Rushing smirked when he was informed. But Sarah, she didn't break. She called a press conference. "We can seal the doors. We can lock the cages. But evil will always find a crack unless we stop patching and start rebuilding." Cameron Blythe agreed to give up the location of something that would change everything. Authorities followed his directions to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Atlanta. Inside, they discovered an underground archive, notebooks, diagrams, letters exchanged among members of the Pandora network, including high-level professionals, attorneys, teachers, even clergy. The scope of the network was far beyond what had been previously known. And there, buried beneath a stack of files, was the real shock: a list. A list of children's names, survivors, children who had been unknowingly watched, studied, targeted as second-generation subjects for a horrifying plan to reignite the terror years later. Sarah's niece was on that list. Buried in the notes recovered from the warehouse was a document titled The Bloodline Protocol. The premise was chilling: target the children of original survivors, force them into the same cycle of fear, see how trauma echoes across generations, record their psychological decay. It was an experiment, a ritual, and Sarah's family was the crown jewel. Her niece, Ella, had recently reported strange phone calls, toys going missing, Windows open when they shouldn't be. At first dismissed as paranoia, now clearly part of a pattern. Sarah had fought her battle. Now it was about saving the next generation. The FBI launched Operation Nestfall, an urgent manhunt and tactical surveillance program to root out any remaining members of the Bloodline Protocol. Across the country, agents made arrests. Men and women who had infiltrated communities, posed as neighbors, even babysat the children of past victims. It was the largest sweep since the takedown of the original Pandora network. And at the center of it stood Sarah, refusing to flinch. She visited every family on the list. She reassured children, comforted mothers, stood as the living proof that the cycle could be broken. She had become more than a survivor. She was a shield. James Rushing's health began to deteriorate in prison. Terminal illness, just months to live. Fearing death, he requested one last interview with Sarah. She hesitated, but she agreed. In a sterile prison room, surrounded by guards and cameras, they faced each other one final time. He looked smaller, older, but his eyes still carried that glint of control. "I thought I could shape the world through fear," he said. "But you shaped it through pain. You became stronger because I tried to break you. That was never part of the plan." Sarah leaned in. "And you failed." Rushing smiled. Then, he whispered the locations of 2 more missing girls. Their bodies never recovered. And just like that, the final pieces of the puzzle were found. Authorities followed Rushing's confession to a private property he once owned under a shell company, an old orchard. There, beneath the roots of ancient trees, they unearthed 2 shallow graves. The remains were identified as Melissa Carr and Lacey Dowd, 2 babysitters who had vanished in 1987 and 1991. Their cases long forgotten by the public. Their families, after decades of grief, were finally able to say goodbye. Sarah attended both funerals. She didn't speak. She simply stood beneath the trees, watching the wind whisper through the branches, as if nature itself was releasing something heavy. The ground had finally given up its secrets. Sarah never returned to her old life. Instead, she built something new, the Ashlight Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of intergenerational trauma and families affected by long-term stalking and predatory violence. She traveled to schools, prisons, police academies, telling her story, teaching others how to spot patterns, listen to survivors, and see danger where others only saw normalcy. James Rushing died behind bars. No public memorial, no last words, just a cold report in a government file. But Sarah, she lived. Her name became a beacon, not because of the terror she survived, but because she ended it. And the audience, they didn't just watch her journey for closure. They watched it for hope, because sometimes the only thing more powerful than evil is the courage to face it and keep walking forward. Justice had been served, but more than that, light had been restored. Stay tuned for more chilling cases on Cold Case Chronicles, where the truth is always darker than fiction. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to Cold Case Chronicles. We dive deeper into the most chilling, unsolved mysteries, and together, we uncover what was left behind. Like, share, and leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. Stay vigilant. Stay curious. The truth never rests.